All right, folks, so we have a big Supreme Court oral argument on Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Time in the government of Mexico versus Smith & Wesson and the American gun industry. This is a big argument involving whether or not the lawsuit by Mexico can move forward in American courts or not. We're going to win this one, but we got to talk about it right here and right now. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Box of Donna, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and I'm proud to say the top voice of the Second Amendment at the 2025 Gundies Awards. Thank you for your support. I hope to continue to work hard for the Second Amendment this year. All right, folks, so we have a big oral argument on Tuesday morning, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, in the United States Supreme Court. In that case, we've been tracking of the government of Mexico versus the American gun industry, specifically Mexico versus Smith & Wesson. Now, we in the Second Amendment community are going to win this case. But I want to talk about this in a geeky way because this is very important. Remember how I've explained to you before that when you look at major cases like Supreme Court cases, there are two things that are important, equally important from our perspective. That is, who wins the case, which party wins, is important, of course, but equally important, if not in many instances more important, for the long-term health of the right to keep and bear arms and our Constitution. Even more important than who wins the case may very well be, and often is, how the case is won or how the case is lost. What is the rationale? What is the holding? What is the reasoning behind why one party to a Supreme Court case wins versus loses? Because it is that rationale, the reasoning, the analysis that is going to stick with us in the Second Amendment community for years, if not decades to come. So with that in mind, who wins the case is important, but how they win and the rationale behind it is just as important. And when it comes to this case of Mexico versus Smith & Wesson, it is in many respects far more important how we win this case. You see, in reality, I don't see how Smith & Wesson and the American gun industry lose this case before the Supreme Court. I think they'll win this case because I think the Supreme Court is going to view the connection between gun companies in the United States, on the one hand, selling through a highly regulated chain of distribution from gun company manufacturers that are licensed FFLs to selling to distributors who are licensed FFLs, who are selling to licensed retailers who are licensed FFLs, and somehow you have a criminal act somewhere along the line that gets these guns into Mexico, and somehow in Mexico, in violation of Mexico law, there are various crimes committed by the cartels and others. A lot of causal connections there between making a gun in the United States consistent with all the regulatory rules. Remember, a lot of these gun companies that are involved in this case are publicly traded. So in addition to the normal gun regulations, they also have to comply with business and security rules promulgated by, for example, the Security and Exchange Commission, because they're selling guns and their stock is publicly traded. So they have a whole nother set of regulations they must comply with. So with all that said, to somehow hold American gun companies liable for criminal activity that violates not only American law, arguably, but also certainly violates Mexico law that says you cannot have guns and you cannot commit murder with guns throughout the country of Mexico. So I don't see how this case moves forward because I think it will be dismissed as a matter of law on the grounds of causation by saying that there is just no way on earth that the government of Mexico can sue the American gun industry and can prove in court a causal connection, a legal causal connection between the selling of the gun in the United States and crimes committed in Mexico. Okay? I don't think the Second Amendment community, I don't think the gun industry is going to lose this case. So why is this case a big deal to us? Well, it's a big deal for several reasons, and this is what we're going to have to be tracking. As you may recall, where a lot of this comes from is in the late 1990s under President Bill Clinton and HUD Director Andrew Cuomo at the time. There was a series of lawsuits commenced by a bunch of folks, a lot of plaintiffs' lawyers that were flush with tobacco money. They had made a lot of money off suing the tobacco industry, and they looked for the next industry to pursue. They thought they could make a lot of money off the gun industry, so they teamed up with cities like the city of Chicago, I believe, the city of New Orleans, and so on, and they all worked together in conjunction with the Clinton administration and Andrew Cuomo, the head of HUD at the time, and to bring these lawsuits against the gun industry on their various negligent manufacturing theories, negligent marketing theories, all sorts of nonsense, okay? And that ultimately all went awry and failed for a whole bunch of reasons, including the election of George W. Bush in 2000, which gave rise to, in 2005, the enactment of the Protection and Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. Now, the Protection of Commerce in Lawful Arms Act, sometimes referred to as PILCA, that's the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. Screw up the acronym. They have to have acronyms if they enact laws in Washington, of course. So the way the PILCA law worked was that you could not, as a matter of federal law, hold gun companies liable for just making an ordinary gun and selling an ordinary gun just because some nut job goes out there and uses the gun that you made to commit a crime. Now, this should not have been controversial. This is basic black letter tort law going all the way back to jolly old England and the common law written about by, for example, commentators like William Blackstone. This is no big deal. Everyone understands that if I make a baseball bat for you to play baseball with and somebody uses that baseball bat to hit somebody over the head to rob a bank, you don't sue the baseball bat company. Likewise, if someone makes a DVD player, a VCR, a Betamax, all these things. Now, these were litigated over the years, by the way, and someone goes out there and violates federal copyright law using the internet, a Betamax, a VHS, a CD, a DVD, doesn't matter. If they violate copyright law or federal law in some way by either illegally recording something or misbehaving in some way, again, you don't sue the manufacturer of the VCR, the VHS tape, the Betamax, the internet, the website, and so on, because they're not responsible for that because someone misabuses things. Now, this is analogous to the gun issue where we argue that just because someone can misuse a gun doesn't mean you punish law-abiding Americans who want to exercise their right to keep and bear arms. And the Supreme Court has repeatedly said this in many cases, not just the Second Amendment cases like Heller and McDonald and Bruin and so on, but even in the copyright context of like the Sony case back written by, at the time, Justice John Paul Stevens. So with that said, there's no way, in my view, that Mexico is going to get through this. They're going to be knocked out in this case. The question is, how will that happen? And part of it, of course, will be the application of this federal statute, the Protection and Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, or PILCA, because this is something where the anti-gun states have been enacting laws and trying to claim that the exceptions to PILCA somehow allow these anti-gun lawsuits to move forward. Because remember, these anti-gunners, at the end of the day, don't actually believe they can win in court because they really can't win in court. What they can do successfully is bankrupt the American gun companies, bankrupt the American gun industry by imposing millions and millions and millions of dollars in discovery costs and other headaches, like distracting the management from doing what they do, which is to make new guns, invent new guns, sell guns, and distracting them with these lawsuits. And of course, at the same time, trying to bankrupt them with the legal fees. And at the same time, in addition to those legal fees, it makes it harder for these gun companies to be able to procure, for example, liability insurance, because insurance companies are worried about being sued by these gun companies being sued, and then they have to cover it. So it drives up the insurance costs of these gun companies and making it very difficult to do business for in the gun space and the ammo space and so on. And the consequence of that is, from our perspective as Second Amendment consumers, it drives up the price of the guns and the ammunition and the equipment that we want to buy as consumers. And of course, it runs the risk that these things can go out of business and we might not be able to buy them in the first place. And of course, the right to keep and bear arms presupposes that we have the ability to acquire these weapons. If we can't acquire the weapons, if we can't acquire the ammunition, well, then we don't really have a Second Amendment right. So this is why the Supreme Court case is very important. Now we're going to get just a little bit geeky here. There's really two ways, there's two possible ways that the Supreme Court is going to rule in favor of Smith & Wesson and the gun industry as I see it. There is a good way and there's a less good way. Now, there are other people out there in the Second Amendment community are cheering. This is going to sound counterintuitive, but listen carefully. I'm going to make you the smartest person in the room. I'm going to elevate your game. There are some people in the Second Amendment community right now arguing that we really want to see a 9-0 ruling. And that's sort of true, but not really. What do I mean by that? You see, there is a broad way to win this case, which is what we want in the Second Amendment community. What we want is the Supreme Court to say broadly that it's absurd to think that lawsuits writ large against the American gun industry or against gun companies can succeed because you cannot hold them liable for the criminal conduct of people over whom they have no control. That unless these people are literally selling the gun to the bad guy, and when they sell the gun to the bad guy, they know the bad guy is going to do something bad with it, and they still sell it to that person, and then that person does something bad, then maybe there's liability. And basically what the gun industry is arguing is kind of what's known as a directness theory, to say that there has to be a direct, clear connection between a gun company misbehaving directly, knowingly, and handing a gun to someone who's going to do something bad with it, and that person doing something bad with it. That is what has to be proven, which is basically never occurs in American life. These gun companies sell in the normal course through background checks and whatnot, and someone then takes the gun and down the road, maybe even years and years later, maybe not even the person they sell to, and misuses that gun in a crime. So that is what we want. And the reason why we want a broad ruling is there's a lot of other lawsuits being brought by the anti-gunners around this country trying to knock out the gun industry in all respect. There's cases involving, I think there's some cases in New York and cases in the Midwest, whatever. The point is that we want a broad ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court. So in all those cases pending around the country that have been brought by anti-gun groups and anti-gunners propping up plaintiffs, we want to have a big win by the Supreme Court so that Supreme Court precedent can then be used by the lawyers in these cases all around America today to knock out these anti-gun lawsuits against the gun industry, against the gun manufacturers on the grounds that PLACA knocks it out. And that is what we want, a broad ruling. Now, here is my concern and why I'm almost hesitant to say I want to see a 9-0 ruling. I know it's counterintuitive, but hear me out. What I don't want to see and what we do not want to see is a narrow ruling that basically only applies, listen carefully, that basically would only apply to say that foreign plaintiffs, foreign governments, foreign people suing in American courts cannot sue gun companies for crimes that occur in their countries. You see the narrow ruling? The broad ruling that we should be cheering for is that you don't want and cannot allow gun companies to be held liable for the criminal conduct of criminals, period, full stop. You want that broad ruling. What you don't want is a narrow ruling, and an example of a narrow ruling might be that we hold, the Supreme Court hereby holds that foreigners, people from out of the United States, cannot sue in American courts American gun companies and hold them liable for crimes that occur overseas. Do you see the difference? Because if the holding was that narrow and it just applied to foreign non-American plaintiffs for activities and crimes that occurred in their home countries outside of the United States, that would be a narrow holding, because yes, it would protect the American gun industry from lawsuits in the United States by plaintiffs from Germany, from Mexico, from Canada, whatever, and that would be good in one sense and would knock out this Mexico case, which would be good. So it would be a good result. But the downside is when the Supreme Court precedent in this Mexico case was then cited by pro-Second Amendment lawyers and pro-gun industry lawyers in future cases of American plaintiffs suing American gun companies, the American plaintiffs would be able to say, no, that case in the Mexico Supreme Court case is distinguishable and different than our case because we represent American plaintiffs suing American gun companies for crimes that occurred in America. And the Supreme Court decision in the Mexico case dealt with plaintiffs from Mexico, from out of the United States, suing American gun companies in America, and that's totally different. So if you get a narrow ruling, it won't be nearly as good and won't be able to use across America for these kinds of cases. Now, the reason why I talk about this, we may not want a 9-0 decision in favor of the defendants. Why do I say that? See, this is where Inside Baseball has me worried a little bit. Chief Justice John Roberts really likes these 9-0 consensus decisions. We all get in this together and sing Kumbaya. That's just kind of the reality of the way Chief Justice John Roberts likes to work. He likes these unanimous decisions to show cohesion to the court. And what I'm fearing could happen, I'm not saying it will, but what I'm fearing and worried about is this. I could see some savvy person on the left, either Justice Kagan, could be Justice Brown Jackson, Justice Sotomayor, coming together and saying to Chief Justice John Roberts, look, Chief Justice, why don't we agree to issue a narrow ruling in favor of the gun industry? We can all agree on the outcome. The gun industry is going to win. Smith & Wesson's going to win this case. We all agree 9-0. But why don't we agree to rule on narrow grounds so you get a 9-0 ruling? Because if you want a broad ruling of the sort of thing that perhaps Justice Thomas or Justice Alito want, or Justice Gorsuch wants, well, now maybe you're going to peel it off, and now it's going to be a 6-3 ruling or a 5-4 ruling or a 9-0 ruling with 6 in the majority and 3 in concurrences and whatever. You see what I'm saying? It becomes messy. So why don't we all agree for a narrow ruling that's 9-0 and only one opinion, see-ball, hit ball? And that is not what we in the Second Amendment community want, but that is the result that someone like Justice Kagan is going to want, because she's going to want a narrow ruling so that lawsuits against the American gun industry by American plaintiffs, by American lawyers in America can continue to harass the Second Amendment community, can continue to harass the gun industry, and can continue to serve as a conduit for encouraging these lawsuits, because the liberals on the Supreme Court are much more sympathetic to allowing lawsuits to be brought by America's plaintiffs bar, the trial bar, and the like. And we in the Second Amendment community don't benefit from that, and we generally don't want that to occur. So anyway, the bottom line is, I think we are going to win this case of Mexico versus Smith & Wesson. The question's going to be, and we'll listen carefully to the oral argument on Tuesday, is how are we going to win the case? Will it be a broad holding, which we really, really need, because it will knock out other cases against the gun industry in other contexts here going forward, versus what we don't want is a narrow holding that really just applies to foreign plaintiffs like Mexico, Germany, Canada, and the like? That will be better than nothing and knock this Mexico case out, which is a good result, but it's not the result that we're really looking for. We want a broad victory here and not just a narrow victory. So there you have it. We will cover this on Tuesday morning. I will shoot a video afterwards. I'm not going to do anything live. I think it's a waste of time. If you want to listen to it, I'll put a link around there on X. You should listen to it yourself. I'm not going to sit there and point and do stuff like that at the oral argument. It's a waste of time, in my opinion. But I will do a video on Tuesday afternoon telling you my impressions. I think that will be far more valuable to you. You should listen to the argument. It's always interesting to hear what people have to say, but I will give you a summary on Tuesday afternoon and let you know my impressions based on that argument. All right, folks, so there you have it. Hope you learned something here today. Make sure you subscribe both here on YouTube and on Rumble. We're trying to get to 200,000 YouTube subscribers. Don't forget to follow me on X at 4 Boxes Diner, and I look forward to talking to all of you very soon here at the 4 Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.